I don't think Japan is the country that you want to point to as your model homogenous society.
I just disagree. I think it is a model society.
So we've spoken about Japanese politics a fair bit on this channel over the years, and I've actually covered it in like multiple different videos that aren't necessarily about Japanese politics, and I'm going to bounce off those videos and the reaction to my videos. Today, you might have seen the thumbnail, I'm sure I put them in. I put in Hideo Kojima and I've put in Jontron. You guys might be asking, why are they relevant to this discussion? Probably more so Jontron than Hideo Kojima, but I'm going to get into all that today. So what I wanted to talk about is why certain Western right-wingers simp for Japan, specifically simp for the idea that Japan is successful because its population is fairly ethnically homogenous, but we're going to get into some of the nuances of that later on. And obviously Japan has a perception for being very nationalistic, so I also want to get into some of those perceptions and talk about Japan's Communist Party, because Japan actually has one of the biggest communist parties outside of communist-run nations. And unlike a lot of communist parties across Western nations, they actually are an electoral force. A minor one at that, but they are important in Japanese politics. And they do actually have a lot of disagreements, especially recently with the Chinese Communist Party. So that is what the video is going to be about today. Thanks so much for the support recently and the 65,000 subscribers. I totally forgot to go buy another chocolate orange, and I'm actually really annoyed at myself because this is the last video I'm going to be filming here for the next 3 months. I've told a lot of you I'm moving to Spain on Monday, and if all things work out and there are no issues, that's where I will be recording all my videos until April. So no more chocolate oranges. We're going to have to rebuild the pyramid when I get back. So there should be one more there. Sadly, that's not going to be happening, but please keep subscribing. And on that note, if you want to support my work continuing for the future, please consider becoming a patron. I want to build up, like I often say, as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible. You'll get access to the private patrons Discord server and get my Nintendo Switch friend code. Also, please check out my social medias at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. Come join the Discord, come join the subreddit. I live stream 2 times a week, and that stuff is archived on my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra. And because a lot of you say you won't like the video unless I remind you, please like the video and maybe comment. Any engagement helps me and helps me in the algorithm. So with all of that stuff out of the way, let's get into the video. Now let's start with the Jontron stuff, because I know you guys will be wondering, how does he factor into this? So of course I made that massive video about Jontron and Destiny and how this debate they had is a lot worse than you remember. Now, it seems that Jontron had got a lot of his political positions off the poll forum on 4chan. Now, I highlighted in the video that when you are listening to people like this talk, a massive dog whistle often is how they feel about Japan and Japanese society. So the argument he was having with Destiny was about demographics in America and why it's potentially becoming a minority and why that is such an awful thing. Now, he pointed to Japan as a model society because Japan, on the surface, is ethnically homogenous for the most part. Some estimates have it about 98% Japanese. So let me just play you the clip of Jontron and what he's saying, and this is pretty typical for people with these beliefs to simp for Japan.
I think... Sorry, one more time on that?
Do you think that it's okay for a country to stifle its growth a little bit in order to maintain a homogenous cultural identity?
Yeah, I think it's fine. Japan does it. They just did a... And that's what's happening right now in the West. And nobody would ask Japan if it was okay that, Japan become a minority Japanese nation.
But we're not Japan, and I don't care about Japan.
I
You
mean,
want to try to draw a parallel to another homogenous society. Japan is like the worst go-to argument. It's also a dying country of people who, because they refuse to let anybody else in, are having horrible problems with their population. I don't think Japan is the country that you want to point to as your model homogenous society.
I just disagree. I think it is a model society.
But like I said, it seems that Jontron got most of his political opinions from a 4chan thread or something. It's actually a fairly common myth people on the far right like to push, is that Japan has achieved great success in this globalized economy thanks to it being fairly ethnically homogenous, which has erased a lot of the problems you get in Western countries like the UK or the US, which are massive melting pots with loads of different cultures. They hold up Japan as this like model society while ignoring the extreme problems with xenophobia they have in Japan. They won't accept many refugees. There's lots and lots of instances of Japanese people treating immigrant communities very, very poorly, Chinese and Korean especially. Japanese society as a whole also has a problem in how it treats mixed-race Japanese people. And part of the reason why they have stats like 98% homogenous is that if you're mixed race in Japan from two nationalities, you have to choose one or the other. So a lot of them choose Japan despite the fact they are mixed race. But that's how you get the figure that it is 98% homogenous. Of course, you have loads of minority groups in Japan as a whole. Okinawa is a big example. Native Okinawans aren't the same as Japanese on the mainland, obviously treated very, very awfully by the Imperial Japanese. Japan has recently opened its borders a lot more to migrant workers because its aging population and its previous refusal to accept a lot of migrants is really, really hurting its economy at the moment. But just getting into why the far right simp for Japan a bit more, there's a really good article by Carmen Gabriela Lupa I want to read you. Why is Japan the ideal country according to the far right movement? Far right often praise Japan for its nationalistic and isolationist policies, but how did it become such an emblem for the movement? In a country where approximately 98% is native Japanese, it has become the ideal example of what a country should be like for those associated with the ideology of the right. In the refugee crisis that started 3 years ago, Japan has not been keen on taking in any refugees. Japan is one of the countries with the lowest number of accepted refugees. According to a Financial Times article, Japan took only 28 refugees in 2016. Because of this strict refugee policy, members of the right expressed their appreciation for the Japanese immigration policy. Far-right personality Jared Taylor stated in an article that Japanese being homogenous is to be praised, stating that the state is protecting itself from alien cultures that won't adapt to the Japanese way of living. Another aspect far-right members mention about Japan is its low crime rate. Crime in Japan is dropping amid the longest economic expansion in almost 3 decades, making one of the safest nations even safer. The new right considers that the low crime rate in Japan comes from the lack of diversity in the Japanese society. It is well known the right is always against diversity, claiming that multiculturalism has failed. For them, Japan, a country that isn't very multicultural, is seen as an argument against diversity. Whether there is no multiculturalism in Japan is debatable, since other ethnic groups have been living in Japan throughout its history, but even so, more than 90% of the people are native Japanese. Japan maybe hasn't fully given up on its imperialistic past, thus nationalism still exists. Vincent Law asks himself on altright.com why right-wingers admire Japan but fail to follow Japan's lead. Japan is then held up as an example to non-woke whites why they don't love their own people. Another strong advocate of Japan who wishes that the West would take Japan's example is Jared Taylor. After his visit to Japan, he wrote an article saying, Japan proves that a country can open itself to what it considers the best foreign influences while shutting out foreign people, thus stating that a country can be diverse without foreigners migrating there. There are endless ways to be Japanese. Due to its pride in being Japanese and its efforts to preserve its society and culture untouched, Japan has become a blueprint for the utopian perfect societies in the eyes of the right. Japanese policymakers continue to be a model for right-wing advocates who want to adopt similar laws in their countries. By looking at the low rate of accepted refugees and the lack of extensive crime rates, right-wing groups continue to support Japan and see the nation as an ideological ally. Japan's contrast between being both a highly modernised society and a very traditional homogenous civilization remains the right's core argument for unity, playing a huge role in achieving a prosperous country that protects its own culture. As long as Japan will have the lack of diversity and multiculturalism, the right will view the nation's success as an effect of that. So they praise everything good as a result of this homogenous society while ignoring the bad things. Also, there's plenty of other things they love about Japan. Of course, a lot of them are weebs. 4chan and 2chan were actually designed for people to discuss anime in the first place. I've made loads of videos about these weeb types loving this stuff. I've made videos about Tojo boos who even like simp for Imperial Japan. That obviously helps with a lot of far-right types that Japan was this military dictatorship in the 1930s and 40s. So that is just a few reasons why they love this stuff. I've made whole videos talking about this. Hopefully I will link them or just throw them up on screen right now and put some cards on so you can go watch them, because I discuss multiple other things about Japanese politics, especially the Japanese right wing, which I'm not going to talk about as much in this video, but it's really, really interesting, and how the US built up Japan and also let off some of the worst Japanese criminals from the war just to stick them in the new governments, as they propped up Japan as like this anti-communist base they could use in the fight against the Soviets and China, is very, very interesting, also pretty depressing, but indicative of the wider Western policy of what they did with their former enemies from World War II. So let's shift gears now and talk about the Japanese left. Now, a lot of the most famous Japanese creatives often create art that is very, very left-wing. A lot of the most famous Japanese games often contain a left-wing political message, like the Final Fantasy games, of course, the Metal Gear Solid games, which we're going to focus on now. But I've made a whole video about this. For some reason, a lot of people consider Hideo Kojima, the creator of Metal Gear Solid and Death Stranding, to be some sort of right-wing libertarian or just a right-winger. So here is one comment I got on my video debunking this stuff. So listen to this. Kojima and his team are Japanese and pretty much pro-peace and pro not sending soldiers to die in meaningless wars kind of folks. I think they are nationalists, as majority of Japanese are, which is pretty much not a socialist last time I checked. There is a middle ground that they're trying to shed some light on, not a binary of either capitalism or socialism. Now, of course, Japan does have a lot of nationalism, but the purpose of this video is to show you it also has a pretty strong communist movement, one of the largest in the world outside communist-run countries. Obviously, this is a massive stereotype that Kojima must be some sort of nationalist because he is Japanese, and also totally ignores all the messages in his games. Now, I've made so many videos about Metal Gear Solid being left-wing, but I do think it's kind of interesting to kind of frame what we're talking about with the Japanese Communist Party. Now, a big thing for Japanese communists and Japanese leftists is the US military presence in Japan and Japanese territory, and also things like nuclear energy, because of course Japan is the only country on Earth that has been attacked in a war by nuclear weapons. While not exclusive to Japanese leftists, it's very, very key and a foundational sort of belief for Japanese communists and leftists. It's also heavily present in the Metal Gear Solid games. And Kazuhiro Miller, who I believe in the Metal Gear Solid games, is a bit of a stand-in for Hideo Kojima's own personal politics because he is one of the main Japanese characters in the games. He talks about a lot of things to do with Japan's constitution, its anti-nuclear policies, and its anti-war policies, its anti-military policies that they had to adopt after the end of World War II.
The B-29s kept on coming, razing other major cities throughout Japan without mercy. Then, in August, they dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered to the United States at last. After that, Yokosuka was flooded with American soldiers come to occupy the country. My mother was still in her mid-teens, and she learned from her cousin how to survive in that town, by servicing the troops. That's how she met my father, and how I was born.
We're saying Japan has a peace constitution too.
Yep. Japan renounced war in Article 9 of its constitution, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained.
There's also a bit where Kaz talks about Che Guevara visiting Hiroshima and talking about the US presence in Japan after the war.
The year the Cuban Revolution was won, Che visited Japan as a member of an economic delegation. While he was there, he visited Hiroshima.
Hiroshima.
Since he was there to discuss economic issues, Hiroshima wasn't part of the original itinerary. Some said the Ministry of Foreign Affairs didn't want to let him go, but he went anyway. He visited the Peace Memorial Museum and the Atomic Bomb Survivors Hospital. Apparently it gave him quite a shock. As a doctor, it must have been painful for him to see how the victims suffered. He was quoted as saying, "They put you through this, and still you do whatever America says." Those words really hit me hard, especially when I think of my mom. He said something else, too. Let us all love Hiroshima and its people.
The inclusion of things like this about Japan, and of course, the massive simping for Che Guevara in Peace Walker especially.
I was shocked the first time I saw you. You look so much like him.
I look like El Che, huh?
I wonder if Che and his men ever sat around and drank mate.
I bet they did. Che was famous for his love of the stuff. I'm not even worthy of polishing his boots. He was a true revolutionary and a great warrior.
I'm with you there. Can you believe that when he first went to Cuba with Fidel, they had only 12 guys with them?
Leads me to believe that Hideo Kojima has pretty left-wing politics, not to mention that like Death Stranding is a response to Trump and Brexit and all the division of 2016. Literally the slogan of Death Stranding is Make America Whole Again, the response to Make America Great Again. But there are loads of stuff throughout the Metal Gear Solid games that show that Hideo Kojima is some type of leftist, and not every Japanese person is some sort of right-wing nationalist. Now, the perception of that comes from probably a nationalist party dominating Japanese politics for nearly the whole of the post-war period. So an Economist article, How the LDP Dominates Japanese Politics. Since its founding in 1955, Japan's Liberal Democratic Party has dominated the country's politics. The party has ruled uninterrupted, save two brief stints in 1993 to 1994 and 2009 to 2012. Since regaining power in 2012, the LDP and its smaller coalition partner, Komito, have won 6 consecutive national elections. When voters go to the polls in the lower house ballot on October 1st, 2021, the LDP is likely to come out on top again, and they did. This comes not in an authoritarian system, but in a democracy with free and fair elections. So the LDP emerged in the wake of America's post-war occupation of Japan and in the crucible of the Cold War, after leftist groups united into a single Japanese Socialist Party in 1955. Japanese conservatives, with a push from America's CIA, decided to merge the two main conservative parties, the Liberal Party and the Japan Democratic Party. The new LDP established the upper hand and went on to oversee Japan's economic growth miracle. It also benefited from a favourable electoral system skewed towards rural areas where the party's influence was strong. So this party still dominate Japanese politics. They won the recent election at the end of 2021. They're also very problematic for their revisionist history of World War II. They completely whitewash all the worst actions of the war. But Japanese communism has made a resurgence in the last 10 years. It didn't do so well at the last election, but it made a massive comeback in 2013. So I want to talk about all of these things, their political positions and their differences with the Chinese Communist Party. So currently they have 270,000 members. An article by the Christian Science Monitor in 2013 called Communist Party Makes a Comeback in Japan, when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's Liberal Democratic Party cemented its grip on power with a victory in the upper house election on the 21st of July. The unlikely other winners were the communists. Mrs. Kira was one of the party's newly elected lawmakers who saw the Japanese Communist Party raise its representation in the House of Councillors from 6 seats to 11, giving it a large enough bloc to propose legislation. She was the first communist to win in the 5-seat Tokyo constituency in 12 years, while another young JCP candidate won in Osaka, the party's first victory there in 15 years. Overall, the communists came in second to the ruling party in terms of votes collected in Japan's two giant metropolises. Founded in 1922, the JCP is the oldest political party in Japan and has enjoyed constant representation in parliament for longer than any other party. But until recently, its image was one of older activists and struggled to attract younger voters. As well as a savvy leveraging of social networks and video streaming platforms, the party created a series of online mascot characters that addressed individual issues such as the planned consumption tax hike, shady business practices, the heavy US military presence on Okinawa, and the constitutional change. If we did take power, the JCP wouldn't try to implement a communist economy immediately. It would require huge changes, and we would seek the support of people for each step, Kira says. And we would want to use the best parts of the current economic system too. So just a bit of history from its website and then going into its key policies. The JCP was founded on the 15th of July 1922. At the time, Japan was subjected to the despotic rule under the Tenno Emperor system. Japanese citizens were deprived of all democratic rights, and Japan took the path of wars of aggression against other Asian countries and implemented colonial rule over them. Outlawed from the onset of its founding, the JCP suffered all kinds of oppression and persecution. It was the only political party in Japan that opposed the wars of aggression. Upholding the banner of freedom and human rights, the party fought for the liberation of Korea and Taiwan, both colonies of Japanese imperialism, and for the full independence of other colonial and semi-colonial nations in Asia. In 1945, the Pacific War ended. With the defeat of Japanese imperialism, the JCP for the first time won legal status and was allowed to engage in political activity, which marked the beginning of a new advance for the party. So going on to its policies, one of the JCP's main objectives is terminating the Japan-United States military alliance and the dismantling of all American military bases in Japan. It wants to make Japan a non-aligned and neutral country in accordance with its principles of self-determination and national sovereignty. There are about 130 American military bases and other related facilities in Japan, with the Okinawa Prefecture having the largest American military base in Asia. The JCP has also traditionally championed pacifism. With regard to the Japanese self-defense forces, the JCP's current policy is that it's not principally opposed to its existence, but it will seek to abolish it in the long term. The JCP also opposes possession of nuclear weapons by any country or the concept of military blocs, and opposes any attempt to revise Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which says, "Never again will Japan be visited with the horrors of war through the actions of government." Regarding the resolution of disputes, it argues that priority must be given to peaceful means for negotiations, not to military solutions. The JCP says Japan must adhere to the UN Charter. In terms of the economy, the JCP strives to change the nation's economic policy of what it sees as serving the interests of large corporations and banks to one of defending the interests of the people, and to establish democratic rules that will check the activities of large corporations and protect the lives and basic rights of people. Regarding the issue of the international economy, the JCP has advocated establishing a new international democratic order on the basis of respect for the economic sovereignty of each country, and strongly opposes the participation of the TPP. The JCP sees the US transnational corporations and international financial capital as pushing globalization, which it says is seriously affecting the global economy, including the monetary and financial problems, as well as the north, south, and environmental problems. So in terms of foreign policy, they adhere to the idea that Japan as an Asian country must stop putting emphasis on diplomacy centering on relations with the US and the G8 summit, and put Asian diplomacy at the center of its foreign relations. It supports establishing an independent foreign policy in the interests of the Japanese people, and rejects uncritically following any foreign power. It advocates that Japan issues further apologies for its actions during the Second World War, and has condemned prime ministerial visits to the Yasukuni Shrine. In the 1930s, while their party was illegal, it was the only political party to actively oppose Japan's war with China and World War II. However, they do support Japanese territorial claims over the Kuril and Senkaku Islands and the Liancourt Rocks. So worth keeping in mind that stuff when you think about why they might not get on with the Chinese Communist Party. Furthermore, the JCP has condemned North Korea's nuclear weapons testing, calling for sanctions but opposing the prospect of a military response. So a lot of those policies are what you would expect, but it does have a Japanese flavour in regards to like things like the Senkaku Islands and North Korea, and the foreign policy thing. In terms of like they are advocating from a Japanese perspective, they also don't immediately want to get rid of the emperor. They just only want him in a ceremonial role. Because of their relatively small nature, they also advocating allying themselves with other parties who aren't socialist, which they often do during election time. But because the last election was such a disaster, I think all the people involved are now rethinking this alliance, because it clearly is not working in opposing the domination by the Liberal Democratic Party. But now I want to talk about the differences between them and the Japanese Communist Party, and how recently the Japanese Communist Party have essentially moved away from the Chinese Communist Party. So Nikkei Asia writes, Japanese Communist Party's long goodbyes to its China comrades. So this is a very, very interesting article. More than 3 decades on from the collapse of the USSR, the Japanese Communist Party lives on. Although there have been periods of conflict, they have maintained a warm relationship with their Chinese counterpart since 1998. That has begun to change this year, 2020. Japanese Communist Party revised its platform last month for the first time in 16 years, adding an implicit jab at China and its Communist Party among the many changes. First, it deleted a positive reference to China that existed in the previous platform, which said Beijing was beginning a new quest for socialism, including the effort to achieve socialism through a market economy. The new document avoids spelling out China, but says in language that echoes criticism of the USSR under Stalin that increasing great power chauvinism and hegemonism among several major powers run counter to global peace and progress. The change of tone was expressed more bluntly by Kazuo Shi in a speech about the revisions, in which he referred to the Chinese Communist Party as the Chinese Party in place of its proper name on several occasions. The Chinese Party calls itself socialist and communist, but its great power chauvinism, hegemonism, and violations of human rights have nothing to do with socialism and are not worthy of the term communism, he asserted to applause from the crowd. This parting of the ways of Beijing is not simply a reflection of skepticism towards China or the sort of gaining ground elsewhere in the world. Xi's declaration positioned the Japanese Communist Party as the sole legitimate heir to the socialism of Marx and Engels. The JCP leader said that the party has battled against great power chauvinism and hegemonism in the name of socialism for more than half a century, alluding to the ideological conflict with the Soviet Union that began in the 50s. The party took issue with Stalin's dismissal of the thinking of Marx and Engels as belonging to an older time, accused them of crafting a superficially similar but different ideological structure to suit his own convenience. It also objected to his purges of political opponents and oppression of minority groups. Soviet leaders criticized Stalin's rule after his death, but the Japanese Communist Party rejected this and accused them of carrying on Stalin's great power chauvinism and bureaucratic dictatorship. The feud with the Soviets led to what party members have called is the Japanese Communist Party's a schism between those who went along with the Stalin-led USSR's demands for armed revolution and for those who fought an independent Japanese Communist Party based on the socialism of Marx and Engels. After this rupture, the party worked to purify its own Marxist Engelsian brand of socialism. Tetsuzo Fuwa, a party elder and perhaps its main ideological pillar, has said that the Japanese Communist Party occupies a unique position in the world, noting that there are almost no parties in capitalist countries that grasp the theory and spirit of Marx and Engels and make an effort to consider the outlook for future change through that lens. The split with the Chinese Communist Party is a natural consequence of this stance, but the nature of the Japanese Communist Party's criticism marks a step into new territory for the party. The removal of the indirect reference to China as a nation on the quest for socialism from its platform makes clear that the party no longer recognises Beijing as a comrade at all. Beijing's high-handed approach in the waters of the East and South China Seas and its violation of human rights has fanned anti-Chinese sentiment in Japan and more broadly. We can't stand to be lumped together with them, a senior Communist Party official said. How best to distance itself from China is a question that is crucial to the party as it seeks to keep carving out a role in Japan's history. Despite the obvious things, it's clear the Japanese Communist Party's split with China, I guess, is more of a worldview thing. So in terms of the Japanese Communist Party, they want a peaceful world. They are more pacifistic, where China isn't pacifistic. It has a massive military. It is constantly militarizing, obviously trying to become the new world power after the US. And in its rhetoric is prepared for war with other countries, where the Japanese Communist Party do not want this at all. I would also say electorally, it probably makes a lot of sense for the Japanese Communist Party to break any ties or solidarity with the Chinese Communist Party, because if they want to grow in Japan, because generally, for both good and bad, Japanese society has a massive problem with the Chinese Communist Party. The bad reasons are, of course, it's still a carryover from World War II, a war Japan has never properly apologised for, where they deny a lot of the crimes they committed, and that tension has always existed there. But also with maybe young socialists, they do not like China's expansionism, they don't like China's militarisation, they don't like China's human rights abuses. So I guess it just makes more sense to finally break it off with China. Obviously, they're claiming to be like the true heirs to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. I obviously don't know how accurate that is. I don't know enough about global communist parties to tell you if the Japanese Communist Party is the true successor or even the most in line with Marx and Engels. I am pretty ignorant about all the communist parties in the world. I know there's other big communist parties, like the Indian Communist Party is one I'm very interested in, but haven't read enough about. But I still think that's a very, very interesting history this group have, in that they're the oldest political party. They existed under like brutal oppression from the imperial Japanese government, only group to oppose the wars at all. And then, of course, when they get more popular after the war, a lot of anti-American sentiment fueling this stuff. Of course, the CIA help fuel their opposition. the opposition, which went on to dominate Japanese politics for years, basically doing pretty much all the US says. But you can see how in the context of World War II, of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, of the American presence in Japan and how it often treats Okinawans and general Japanese people, that this would fuel a lot of socialist sentiment. But of course it's in a difficult place in that Japan's two main adversaries in the region are communist states in North Korea and China. But that is it for the video. Hopefully you've got a good indicator of why both Western right-wingers love Japan, but how Japan is a lot more nuanced than you'd think, and why there is a large communist movement in Japan itself, and why it's not surprising that some of your favourite Japanese entertainment is actually made by Japanese leftists, and despite the stereotype of them all being traditional conservative nationalists, there actually are a lot of Japanese communists who have loads in common with Western communists. So that is the last video I'm filming in England. I might put up a video next week that I made a long time ago that I took down about this former star of Love Island who started this really weird right-wing podcast. I might put that back up. I'm not sure yet. But if you like the video, please follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. Join my Discord, join my subreddit, maybe join my Patreon. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.